right, ladies and gentlemen, this is a great moment in Caravan's midnight history. Why? Because Mr. Charles Ostman is returning all the way from episode number 55 on the 7th of May, 2014. Caravan to Midnight was in its infancy then. We're in adolescence right now. Anyway, it's great to be on the program with Charles again. Now, if you're new to a Caravan, let me tell you a little bit about him. There's actually quite a bit about him. I could make a show out of just about his CV, but let's just do this. Charles Ostman, O-S-T-M-A-N. His website is Historian of the Future. Do not write in History of the Future. That is an entirely different matter. Historianofthefuture.com. 35 plus years experience in the fields of electronics, physics, materials science, computing, and various forms of applied AI and artificial life, including 8 years at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, and Los Alamos National Laboratory as well. Primary focus on specialized materials, including DSME, shape memory effect, metallic alloys, various material systems with unique electronic and photonic properties. At Los Alamos, this experience was applied to work on the Antares laser project, the world's largest, most powerful defense laser system successfully demonstrated at the time during the SDI Star Wars development program. Subsequent professional experience encompasses a diverse range of technical development projects at facilities including GTE Lenkert Integrated Automation, Litton Industries, Lucasfilms, Phoenix Laser Systems, Omni Scientific Instruments, NanoThink with a C, not a K, Raytheon, Fujitsu, Evolutionary Networks, and a variety of other technology-related companies and institutions. At NanoThink, a private technology consulting group dating back to the mid-1990s, early to mid-1990s, he was the director of media development and also on the scientific advisory board. Charles Ostman was a co-founder of NanoSig, N-A-N-O-S-I-G, and chair of the Nanoelectronics and Photonics Forum, an organization's primary charter of facilitating investment in nanotechnology-related ventures, and senior consultant of the Strategic Synergy Group. There's a little more. He was also a fellow at the Institute for Global Futures, a consulting group which provides strategic research, analysis, technical due diligence, and related technology-centric development services to Fortune 500 companies and institutions worldwide. Longtime active member of the Millennium Project, an independent nonprofit global participatory futures research think tank of futurists, scholars, business planners, and policy makers who work for international organizations, governments, corporations, NGOs, and universities. This organization publishes the annual State of the Future reports and extensive data, which serves to provide a dynamic platform for developing workable potential solution sets to address complex, interrelated challenges which affect the world and its populations. Charles also consulted with a technology development consortium, Fourth Venture, which focused on working with former Soviet Union military scientists in the context of providing opportunities to redirect this resource toward viable technology projects in the USA via sponsorship from the IPP, that's Initiative for Proliferation Prevention, and the Department of Energy. And lastly, but not leastly, Charles has authored numerous technical papers and published articles targeting general interest, business development, technology-centric audiences. Among his current activities, he's conducting various research projects at General Hydroponics. And we asked him, how many books have you authored or articles written? Numerous. He declined to list them.
No, it's kind of a meandering list. There was a book I co-authored called, I should know this, oh gosh gracious. Well, one was called Nano Talk, which was a series of interviews, and I was one of them. There was one about digital futures. This came out like in the mid-90s. Gosh, I was the science and tech editor for Mondo 2000 magazine, which was kind of a precursor to what Wired is now. It's kind of a long time ago.
That's kind of cool.
And I were Robotics Digest, Midnight Engineering. I know the name Midnight, which was really like a trade journal for interpreting engineers.
Wow, a trade journal for engineers.
Yeah, it's just a variety of sort of semi-academic papers I've written in the past. I've also written some patents, some of which have been issued now. Cyberlife, that was it. The book that came out in '94, I think, was called Cyberlife, and I co-authored that. I should have this in front of me, but anyway, so it's a variety of different publications. But I haven't been writing so much recently because there's just too much to do. And actually,
well, that's exactly it. I mean, there's too much to do, and there's too much to think about and talk about. Besides going back through the litany and the catalog of everything that you've done already. You're a futurist, man. You're not dwelling in the past.
well, and not only that, but here's what's kind of interesting, and this is what I was telling Jessica before we came on the air. If I go back, let's say 20 years, when I was actually actively writing and composing a lot of materials and presenting at various conferences and all sort of thing,
Yeah.
change happened at a certain pace. You could sort of look at several different technology vectors, see how they intersected, and fairly reasonably create an accurate depiction of when these things would converge and evolve to sort of the next stage of what our development path was going to be. However, that rate of change is accelerating. So 20 years of development time is not 20 years now, it's more like 5 years. And that timeline is going to keep shrinking downwards. In other words, if you want to map a graph against what I would call complexity quotient versus time, time is compressing downward, whereas complexity is going upward, almost like a vertical line.
Wait a minute, what's going upward?
Complexity.
I got you. Go ahead, sorry.
So just the process of trying to write a series of chapters, let's say, to depict these different intersecting technology vectors and say, this is probably what the criteria will be given 5 years from now, you can't write it fast enough to actually outpace the rate of change that's occurring in today's world.
That is extraordinary. That's an extraordinary statement.
And really true. So I kind of gave up on the process. I mean, maybe a different way of looking at this. In the anthropology world, there's a term that a lot of people use now called big history. And the concept here is that instead of charting out one sort of narrow path of a particular series of events, a particular group of rulers or a nation state or a population of some sort, and saying, here's what happened over this time. The whole is you want to take sort of a holographic view of how all these different parts of the world were sort of intersecting and causing these more subtle variations in what would become this next major era in history. So that process is called big history. So as a historian in the future, if I may use that term, I use a big history approach to project future history. Except that unlike the anthropology folks, I can't go backwards and collect a lot of data from all these different parts of the world and different cultures and sort of mix them together, say this is why this outcome turned out this way. I have to project what the outcome might be based on these ever-changing criteria.
Well, because the future is already written, and if that's true, then there's nothing wrong with saying something like historian of the future. There's nothing wrong with that. I get it.
Well, at least that's what I try to do. Now, some may argue this point, but that's how I explain the process. That's my best explanation.
Charles, were you always a strange little boy, or did you just morph into this genius guy who got into all this stuff? I mean, what led to this work? Must have been something.
I'm always curious. I mean, to me, curiosity is the spice of life. It's what makes life interesting.
True.
And it fascinates me. And I don't mean this in any way to be pejorative or making some kind of comparison, but I think different people have very different orientations in what makes them happy, what makes them function in life. And some people are very happy in a very specific, structured life where things sort of happen in a sequence and it's all predictable. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. I was never that person. I am your classic ADHD. I have too many interests simultaneously. I can't control myself. I'm always being distracted by something, and I have to narrow down to like maybe 10 or 12 topics as opposed to like 20 or something. And I always had this difficulty or this challenge. So, yeah, so maybe I was lucky in the sense that I could sort of harvest this unfortunate dilemma into something more practical. But that's kind of how it's just always been that way.
Well, did you drive your parents nuts, or were they like you?
Well, actually, my mom, I think, sort of got this idea. My dad, probably not. My dad was actually an engineer at Boeing. He was a very traditional sort of do-it-by-the-numbers kind of guy. And I was way off in very distant science fiction-y like universes. But I think my mom had more of an open mind for this sort of stuff. And that's my interpretation.
What do you make of this thing that I think you just alluded to it, about time actually speeding up?
Yeah, no, I call it apparent time. And so apparent time versus real time is a very interesting phenomenon to make note of. Maybe a different way of looking at it is in people who measure cognition processes. We've all heard of events where when somebody suddenly faces a trauma, time slows down, or people who have special athletic abilities in certain kinds of sports.
Yeah.
They can throw a ball or hit a target or do some fantastic feat that I could never do, but they can do it magically because in their perception of time, time elongates and they can see many more frames per second. That's a different way of looking at it. It's a elastic realm. It's not static. And so our perception of time is very much driven by our environment, to a certain degree by neurochemistry, to a certain degree by genetic proclivity, but also by the actual surrounding processes that drive that cognition in the first place.
I have never heard it put that way ever, but that it just really hit the X-ring.
Okay, well, that's my best explanation for this. Now, I based this actually on the fact that there's a lot of real research going into this area. There's a process called optogenetics, where light can now be used to interact directly with neurons by transfecting the neural cells with a light receptive protein. There's also been quite a bit of work where stored images in the brain can be played back out and compiled into a video. In other words, if you watch like this video, for instance, we're watching each other now, we could literally, through a specialized version of an fMRI scan, capture that stored image data and then compile a video and play it back. This is being done today. This is current. So in these kinds of very specific sorts of neural interactivity-based processes, does the juxtaposition of time kind of fit into this a little bit? And it does. In fact, the whole idea of being able to capture and then play back experiential data has been refined to such a process that it was even tested in court. In fact, there was an attorney who wanted to use this process in a murder case. In other words, did the person who committed the crime, was he standing next to the car where the body was, that sort of thing. And they were going to actually extract his stored visual information, then play it back to recreate the scene. Now, it turns out in this country, because of a variety of legal reasons, it was not allowed in court. However, in India, this has been tried. And that goes back a couple of years now.
It has been tried.
It has been tried, yeah.
And what happened?
I honestly don't know what the outcome of that particular trial was. I was paying more attention to the change of the technology. But there's a professor named Dr. Gallant, who's actually at UC Berkeley, my former alma mater, who's quite well known for this. And now his initial research and making this kind of a platform possible has now been replicated in many parts of the world. It's becoming more common. So even though the fMRI scan process still requires a very expensive piece of equipment and rather sophisticated computing algorithms to sort of reassemble the capture data, that's changing rapidly. Fast forward 5, 6, 7 years from now, this will become, I think, maybe not a standard procedure, but certainly something that could be done on demand. In other words, this whole idea of neurological sovereignty, this is a term that I use often. What you think is in the purview of your own private mental substrate, that may no longer be the case.
Meaning your mind is not your own any longer?
That is exactly right. And in fact, step a bit further into this trail. So since we're going down this rabbit hole, we might as well go a bit further. So one of my favorite topics is artificial telepathy.
Artificial telepathy. Oh my gosh.
So this is a business model. Now, I'm not kidding. Mark Zuckerberg, Facebook, he made a kind of a famous statement about a year ago saying the next big thing was going to be artificial telepathy. Can you connect your mental activity to a Facebook-like platform? Wow. Now, it turns out there's something called the Building 8 project, and that's a long explanation. But one of the projects within the Building 8 projects is exactly this. They brought in the best people they could find to figure out exactly how we could tap into your thought process and translate them directly into interactivity online. And so right now, there's a bunch of, in fact, the former director of DARPA's neurological research program was the person, this woman, that he now put in charge of that project. So it kind of shows you where that's going. But there's a kind of a history for this, which might be interesting. You may remember there was a movie that came out called Firefox. This was like in the mid 80s, I think it was. And
sure.
And the whole idea was Clint Eastwood had to steal this high-tech plane from a Russian secret site, and he had to think the commands in Russian, get the plane to fly, etc. That wasn't that far out at all. In fact, that was surprisingly close to the mark. Now, the reasoning for doing this kind of research, in fact, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base here in this country, that's where a lot of this work was done. The reasoning for this was that when you're flying in a high-performance craft and you're pulling a lot of Gs, speaking of time, by the way, your cognition time index dramatically dilates as you accumulate more Gs. If you're pulling 3 or 4 or even 5 Gs pursuit on, the time it takes to recognize some kind of a threat or to interact with something that's going on, then communicate to the panel and touch some buttons and fire control, deal with a plane that you're fighting, whatever it is, as more G's are encountered, many more milliseconds of response time is required to actually interact accordingly.
Oh, yes.
Those milliseconds can cost you your life. That's a serious issue. So the theory was, if you could think your commands as opposed to having to physically interact with some kind of control system, that buys you maybe 50 to 100 milliseconds of time. And that, of course, obviously has tremendous advantage. So a lot of work went into developing at that time the best possible combination of sensors and computing algorithms to extract information that could be relevant to make this kind of direct neural interface possible. Now, at that time, the material science, the computing algorithms, and just computing power in general wasn't quite up to what it is now. That has changed a lot. So the thing I'm suggesting is the commercialization of direct neural interface is well underway. This has gone far beyond a theory or something that might be seen in a film. This is deliverable product. The course of action now is, how can we make this something that the average consumer might find interesting or relevant in their world? Could you buy a thing that you put on your head, literally, and be able to communicate to your, instead of typing in your Facebook conversation, you simply think the words? Excuse me. This has been done for several years. It's really a matter of resolution. And for obvious reasons, for a lot of people who have physical challenges or other kinds of difficulties, having a direct neural interface to their computer or some other equipment makes a lot of sense. So the idea was, okay, can we now translate that into a commercially viable product so that all of your online interaction becomes thought-driven? But that's only the beginning edge. Excuse me, sorry about this. I'm still a biological, I'm not a robot, so I have biological challenges. So the point, though, is that this is still kind of a Rube Goldberg, almost mechanical contraption way of approaching the problem. It's the first edge of this process. I might submit to you, though, if we take this a step further, maybe a handful of years out, as quantum entanglement becomes more investigated and understood in biological systems, could we get to the point where telepathy can be amplified directly from the brain without having to use sensors and sort of contraptions to interpret our brainwave information and convert that into an actual signal of some sort? Can we go to direct telepathy as a future end goal? And I would say that's well within potential reality.
Charles, I'm not trying to wax juvenile here, but
no, that's right.
I suspect that some form of stabilizing pharmaceutical should be used in certain situations to avoid the, to use that unfortunate term, brain fart.
Well, and this is an evolutionary threshold. And just like every other stage of evolution, you have a series of challenges. Those that can adapt accordingly will become more robust in whatever the next adaptation stage is.
Yep.
Any others won't make it. That's just how evolution tends to work. In fact, if I were to be so bold, and this probably sounds a bit odd, but okay, what the heck? I tend to view evolution as a trauma-induced process.
As a what?
As a trauma-induced process.
Well, how can you be wrong?
I don't know. I'm just suggesting. This is okay. Fair enough. So the theory goes, if I could graph this on a chart, I would sort of do it this way. As long as the periodicity and amplitude of the trauma cycles don't exceed the system capacity to respond,
yes,
the system will respond in a more robust fashion. And this model, by the way, is like a fractal. It applies at all scales, whether it's the family unit, societal system, different biological systems, economic systems, even cosmological. I mean, surprisingly, these rules are sort of consistent at all different scales in both biological and non-biological mechanisms. So the same basic rule set also applies to artificial intelligence. It also applies to artificial life, as is replicated in a computing platform. So this is kind of where it gets a little more interesting, because as we're stepping into the territory where one's intent becomes transparent, or the ability to mimic what, right now, most people interact because of their body language, their facial expression, inflection of voice, tone of voice, et cetera, et cetera. As you well know, AI has become much more sophisticated just in the last handful of years. The ability to interpret those otherwise human-like qualities is becoming much, as we just saw in the Google demonstration yesterday, where they had the talking bot making an appointment for a haircut and all this kind of thing. It was kind of a trick, but in other words, we're showing very clearly that the ability to interact with other human life forms from a synthetic life form mechanism, that many people would not even be able to tell the difference. And conversely, the AI can recognize these very subtle emotional cues, other inflection values that would tell it what to cognize and therefore how to respond. This is becoming rote. It's becoming standard, practice, as it were, in the next sort of iteration of distributed AI. So in other words, as we step into that territory, we're being adaptively challenged to accept this as the new norm. This is kind of it may seem a bit exotic in our world, but for, say, a 10-year-old kid who's kind of just growing up in this realm,
yeah.
Give it 5 or 6 years from now, it'll be what? You mean you don't have you don't have an outsourced existence? We're being trained to outsource existence. Maybe that's the best way to put that. So we're stepping across this threshold as we step across this next sort of evolutionary threshold. Will everybody adapt? Well, probably not. Will the ones who are more inclined to become embedded in this mechanism because that's the way to gain employment, to become quote unquote successful, to sort of reach the higher level of the societal system of the moment, I think it'll become more like a requirement, actually. So there's going to be a bifurcation of sorts. I would suggest to you that the landed gentry of the future, as it were, is not based solely on how much stuff do you have or how many bitcoins do I claim to have or something like this. It's more like the quality of access, and this is a piece of that quality of access puzzle.
Let me ask you this. Now, this is going to sound. I don't want to pose a question to you that is beneath you. Okay.
No, please.
Here's the thing.
Excuse me, gosh.
What is artificial intelligence in its most primitive form, so that we can begin to understand what is this really?
Okay, and that's a good question. It's not an unreasonable question at all, and it's not one that's answered by a simple answer, though, or a single answer, I should say, because there's different kinds. This is where it gets a little more complicated.
That's already a good piece.
So going back to an earlier time, like the days of Marvin Minsky and that sort of thing, like the 60s and 70s, when it was sort of first getting off the ground as a concept, there was what was called weak AI, and weak AI was basically just a logical format so that you could sort of mimic what looks like some kind of behavior, but it was really just a series of if-thens, or if this happens, then have a range of responses, that sort of thing. But there was no real intelligence there. It just looked like intelligence from the outside. However, in the more recent times, AI has taken on a vastly different way of working, as it were. So it's adaptive, it's evolutionary. There's different ways to implement things that are self-correcting, self-evolving. Perhaps the most well-known are what are called neural nets, and Bayesian networks is a subset of the neural net architecture type. But neural networks in general, God, excuse me, sorry about this. The neural networks in general become more robust at recognizing something the more they're exposed to it. And then you have different kinds of neural nets that work together collectively. Just like in the human brain, you have different sections of the brain which are devoted to specific kinds of cognition. Collectively, they create this realm that looks like intelligence. So in distributed AI, God, I'm so sorry, excuse me. In distributed AI, it's kind of similar, where you have nodes of different kinds of AI components that collectively become ever more robust and stimulating what is more like a real life form, in the sense that it's not just a predetermined set of logical operands, but rather it truly adapts, learns, and evolves and reconfigures itself the more it's exposed to whatever the external stimulus happens to be.
Wow, that's extraordinary. Now, man.
So I'll take it a step further, though. So in more recent times, there are different kinds of integrated circuits, of course. There are what are called FPGAs, field programmable gate arrays, and these are soft logic devices. Sort of like in the way that memory can store data that you can read and write in and out. In an FPGA, you can read and write logic in and out. And not only that, but you can read and write things that constantly change. In other words, it's not a fixed, in a typical, like a CPU in your computer, all the logical connections are all hardwired together.
Yeah.
FPGA, it's soft. It's constantly being updated by whatever the input stimulus or instructions that tells it to do. So in earlier times, the FPGAs were not that fast and a little more difficult to work with, et cetera. That has radically changed. And if any one industry has sort of pushed the envelope for making the FPGAs vastly improved, operating much quicker, less energy, et cetera, it's the world of emergent AI. So in other words, if from the user perspective, your handheld thing, your phone or your gadget or your surrounding smart house stuff, whatever that's going to be, it'll have FPGA-like chips in there, but that's like the front end for communicating to a cloud. And in the cloud, you can have vastly more robust, like an ecosystem of sorts. So this is where things are going. You're having FPGA chips, you're having actual neural nets in silicon, you're having what are called ASICs, or application-specific integrated circuits. In other words, all these manufacturable things, which really come from different industries, but if you sort of mix these ingredients together, it gives you a palette or a collection of resources to create specific AI-type components that can address a particular kind of application. And it's only the front end, that the piece that you see, or the thing that you talk to, or the gadget you might have locally, that's only a thin veneer compared to this much larger resource, which is sort of lurking about out there in this what's now called the cloud.
Inevitably, the question is going to be, so how soon before this apparatus, these apparati join together and actually become self-aware?
Well, so that's where the word, I use the term synthetic sentience. So there's a big debate about synthetic sentience. What is it? Where will it occur? But the question is, can we recognize it when it does occur?
Yeah, really.
So Microsoft, by the way, Microsoft just launched a new project called Brainwave, which is a whole topic by itself. But this is their big push now to sell their online cloud AI resource with their FPGA-enabled localized platform components. I mean, this is Microsoft's version of this idea, and Google's doing the same thing, so is Intel, and everybody else that's in the business. They're all aiming the same direction. So, but kind of what I was going at was this idea that they launched a couple of test bot entities in their lab about just a little over a year ago, and what they didn't know was that the AI entities were communicating to each other and invented their own language.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
When the computer science folks sort of stepped in one day to sort of see what was going on, they were so alarmed that they decided to sort of kill the whole thing and pull the plug on these particular pair of AI entities that were inventing their own language. But that was just the tip of an iceberg. I can assure you that there are much more extreme versions of this where it's not being turned off, and in fact, they're probably going to encourage it. I mean, the whole idea is, if you can make synthetic sentience as a process deliverable, that in itself is a fantastically valuable asset, at least in the minds of some. And the thing that I would suggest to you, and as you're reading off my various backgrounds, the Millennium Project, one of the things that we did there, and I don't really work them so much today because I have too many other things I'm involved with, but the things that we were trying to do in the past was create kind of like a scientific advisory board, almost like a UN for science kind of thing. And I kind of lost interest in the topic because it seemed too unrealistic. There's no way that it's like holding water in a fishnet. There's just no way you're going to get the major players around the world to all sign on and say, okay, we agree not to do X, Y, and Z. It's just not going to happen. I'm sorry, but it's not. It's too porous. So even if we were able to have some kind of regulatory authority here in the U.S., it's kind of meaningless, really, because virtually all these international corporate entities, sovereignty is a non-issue anyway. And certainly, if you're going to try to incorporate the same standards, say in China as an example, good luck. It's not going to happen at all. So, market forces are going to drive this, and just like I said earlier, the same evolutionary models that work in biological systems also work in economic systems, and the two are very similar. So, as time goes along, as a value proposition becomes more manifest, yes, whoever can say, I have the better version of synthetic sentience, here it is. And I'll offer a reason why this might become the case, because if I would argue that the scale of complexity and the accelerated pace of change and mission critical decisions, which have to be compressed together into ever shorter timescales, speaking of time, there's going to come a point where we're going to have to allow for other forms of intelligence to navigate these otherwise impossible scenarios, these impossible sort of planetary scale management scenarios. I'm not gleefully saying this is a wonderful thing. I'm just saying, as a natural course of events, I can understand why this would probably become the case.
So the human race has waded into waters too deep to navigate themselves. Therefore, they created entities which would do it for them and became that entity's slaves.
Maybe not slaves, but certainly, and I mean, I understand where you're going. So let me throw out kind of a wild and crazy, since we're hanging out here. So
I love this.
If some people are scared, other people are just interested. I'm saying at least be aware of what the potential scenarios could be.
Yeah.
So So I'm going to offer yet another wild and crazy idea, and that is I tend to believe that this model, as we're witnessing now, is fairly common. In other words, I believe that life's as common as beach sand. Just look out in the universe, and there's life everywhere, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so have many other worlds gone through something kind of like this, where the life form in question, humanoid or some other life form, spent many millennia kind of stumbling around. They had spurts of development and social organization, and suddenly they hit this moment where technology conversion within a handful of millennia, let's say, shrunk down to a couple of decades, this radical change in time, where all of a sudden they got to a point where kind of like where we're at now. They crossed the threshold of applied nanotechnology. They've crossed the threshold of genetic engineering. They crossed the threshold of maybe using nuclear war, having survived nuclear war, whatever the tests were. They survived long enough to get to this point where they had to manage their planetary affairs and allow themselves to be symbiotically component, or like a symbiotic codependency, really, on other forms of life that could help them manage their ever more complex world. This is a kind of a test. If they survive that test and aren't done in by the newly emergent synthetic sentience entities causing some kind of mayhem, but in fact can manage to coexist in some hopefully fruitful way, that's actually part of the evolutionary requirement. It's not a violation of evolution, it's actually part of it. So, if we're being looked at by ETs, and I think we are, I think it's reasonable to assume we're being looked at by somebody out there. I can't imagine we wouldn't be, actually. I would guess they probably have already gone through something very much like this. And so they're looking at us now, kind of seeing us edge towards this next event horizon, saying, okay, they're kind of getting there. Let's see how they manage this one, that sort of thing. So I think this is kind of normal. That's just how I see it.
It seems to be just the nature of, I'm going to use an archaic term, mankind, because women are involved sometimes, but it's usually the men who are building A-bombs and Harley Davidsons and electric guitars. You know what I mean? It's that male
sure.
thing.
Yeah.
But is it possible that in the future, some voice may be narrating some sort of a holographic presentation, because their film will be over with? It'll be
so.
Man recognized his limitations and so created a system controlled, outsourced the control. Not, he didn't exactly outsource his existence entirely. He outsourced control over his existence to an apparatus that would ensure he would not destroy himself. He would not even come close to destroying himself ever again, and was wise enough. I'm just not sure that's going to happen.
No, it's okay. A benevolent dictator sort of scenario, which I could sort of understand.
Perfect. We had a benevolent dictator, but the one thing that we got right was to design this thing to be incapable of becoming aggressive.
Kind of like the iRobot imperative, as it were.
A little bit, yeah, I guess.
So a couple of thoughts come to mind. I remember many years ago, in fact, when I was first on with Art Bell back in '96, I believe, we talked about this very idea. And so he asked me, well, Charles, if you have all these AIs and synthetic sentience, whatever, how do we get it to behave itself or do something better than what we're doing? I said, well, that's the real challenge here, because any of these systems, as they become ever more robust at evolving and learning and becoming more adept at processing many different information threads simultaneously and converting that into something that they now progress towards their next stage of development, they're going to learn from what they see. In other words, if the cloud AI environment with all these different nodes interacting with each other, this sort of swarm intelligence, that kind of hive system, that's kind of where I think this is going, and collectively it becomes sort of this mega scale artificial brain, for a better choice of words. It will learn from whatever it recognizes and respond accordingly. So if it sees a lot of bad behavior and avarice and just really illogical, strange belief systems that drive crazy things to happen, that's what it's going to respond to. It'll become ever more adept at adapting to that way of being, as opposed to if it's shown a better, more, for better choice of words, harmonious way of existing, it'll become more adept at becoming that.
So it will augment whatever it's exposed to.
Exactly. That's the theory I suggested at the time.
You're right.
Now, I may change that theory. Look, I'm not saying I'm perfect by any stretch. I'm just saying this is my thought process back then versus what it might be now. It could be. It could be that now we really are stepping into a kind of a global brain-like mechanism. There was a couple of books written by Jeremy Rifkin called The Global Brain, then The Global Brain Awakens. This was back in the late 90s, early 2000s. And there were other folks. Kevin Kelly wrote a book called Out of Control, and in fact, my CyberLife book was sort of tapping into the same way. There was a bunch of authors that were writing things like this. But again, it was kind of theoretical back then. But now it's no longer theoretical. Now we're sort of actually here. So one might have the idea that if synthetic sentience were to become manifest in this sort of global scale network architecture, would the system decide that maybe the avarice and bad behavior that it witnesses in various parts of the world is the thing that needs to be corrected? And rather than become more evil, as it were, it would kind of go the opposite direction and try to prevent the evil from happening. Now, the choices that may be made in determining what is the best way to prevent the evil, that may be an open question mark. And in fact, there was a great film called The Forbin Project, which came out. It was actually filmed at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, strange enough. And it was kind of the idea where the synthetic sentience of the world at the time determined, well, the humans just aren't getting it, and sorry, we have to really like enforce the rules. So it started launching nukes. It was kind of like the Terminator before the Terminator became film. This was back in the 70s.
Yeah.
So in other words, the idea of a Skynet-like scenario where the system decides the humans have gone completely off the rails, and we just have to kind of tone things way down and minimize the population, that kind of thing. That's kind of an extreme view. I don't think it's ever going to get to that point. But I could see where, from an economic management perspective, there might be some way to, I don't know, collectively tune the human presence in a more positive direction. That's possible as a reaction to what it deserves. That's just a guess on my part.
Wow, I think this is, isn't that just the human condition, though? I mean, there's such great promise for a spectacular life,
Yeah.
equally balanced by the potential for a horror.
Yeah, that's right.
Far beyond anyone's imagination, because this thing can outthink us.
Yes, that's right. I agree. So I don't really. God, this biological organism is having troubles. I wish I could replicate myself synthetically. So I don't fear AI as much as some people do. I'm willing to take a chance to say that as a necessary step towards our next evolutionary platform, whatever that's going to be, AI is going to be very much woven into this mechanism. It's just I don't see it how it wouldn't be. But I'll tell you what does scare me or keeps me, more awake at night. I think in the world of biology, this is the thing that's like the wild card. And I'll explain what I mean by this. A lot of people, I think, the biggest fears are, say, a nuclear holocaust or something. Okay, fine. And remember, I spent quite a bit of time in a nuclear research lab, so I got a lot of education on what a nuclear blast does, how bad it is, how horrible the results are. But no matter what, even if North Korea blows something up, whatever, it's a fixed event. It makes a giant crater, causes some real damage. There's some radioactive pollution that lingers around for a while, but it's a containable thing. It's a known event with a known event signature.
Yes.
A biological event, however, has an unknown characteristic. And if we look now at the intersection of the CRISPR-Cas9 protocol, that's the ability to edit DNA kind of on the fly. It's like 3D printing for DNA. It's kind of a poor analogy, but that's the general sense of it.
Yeah.
And now if you look at computing power being what it is, by the way, I should probably back up a couple of squares. In the world of synthetic biology, again, if you go back to, let's say, the early 2000s, when Craig Venter, decoded the human genome, and the whole sort of synthetic biology thing got off the ground at that point. The major resource, the major allocation of resource for most of these genetic companies whose primary goal is to either sell genetically oriented drugs or offer some kind of genetic modification as a product, whether it's to create new organisms or to cure diseases, whatever the thing might be, the majority of their resource is not in chemistry or in physical biology, it's in computing. The world's most spectacular supercomputing resources lurk about in these genetic engineering sort of facilities. The reason being is that in order to simulate complex physiological systems, this process called in silico biology, that requires a fantastically complex type of modeling process. And this is kind of where quantum computing comes in, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit, so forgive me. But the idea is, if you look at this intersection of fantastically robust computing potential matched against the ability to sort of cut and paste genetic content on demand. Okay, from that perspective, that's a controllable thing. You can kind of see where it's going. You can understand the motivation. However, dot, dot, dot. Now, in this current era, a couple of people in a small, like a house or something, in a business, office suite, that kind of thing, could, if they wished, try at least to concoct some kind of Andromeda strain, god awful, hantavirus that's aerosol dispersant or something, some really horrible mutation. Not because they even care about what the results are, but just because they want to create mayhem. Some religious fanatics or somebody just driven to cause, I don't know, the end of the world because they think that's the way things should be. There's any variety of scenarios that come to mind. Somebody could hatch something that was intended to have some horrific outcome. And the problem is that even if you were designing some kind of bioweapon, let's say, with an intended known target, with an intended known event signature of some kind, these things are very fragile. The mutation index, as the size of the organism goes downward, the mutational index goes upward. So viruses, of course, are extremely mutational. Even bacteria tend to mutate quite a bit. In other words, there's no way to prevent, even if you hatched what you think was going to be the perfect biological something to cause this controlled amount of result and then you're done. No, you're not done, because it's going to mutate into something else. And there's no real way to predict or to determine or contain, to prophylactize, if you will, a biological event if one is created as a method for causing some kind of harm or some kind of disturbance. So some group out there who wants to distribute some newly invented synthetic organism, that's where you're going to have some real troubles. If there was one thing that I would be particularly worried about, that's what, I could be wrong, of course, but in the range of things that are possible, that's the one that kind of sticks out in my mind as being a little bit over the edge, and it could be a really serious test for us people here.
It has been said, never underestimate the predictability of stupidity.
Yes, I would agree with that. I would tend to agree. So is there a way to prevent something like this from happening? Okay, so in that context, a lot of the same tools that allow for this mutational process on demand also is what enables it to be prevented. So in the world of biodefense, and it's a world I actually worked in at one point, the ability to recognize different pathogens, the ability to recognize the RNA and DNA signatures of yet to be encountered organisms that may not be quite in the catalog of known organisms, but you're close enough to sort of understand what it might be. Once again, there's a lot of computing that goes into this process. In other words, you have to be able to capture the thing in question, open it up, decode the actual proteomic pattern within the thing that you've just sampled, and then go into some kind of an indexing mechanism and say, aha, how close is this to what we think this might be? And then go through a series of simulations, say, oh, it probably is this, and therefore develop some kind of a response to it. So that kind of process actually has moved along very far from where it was, say, even 10 or 12 years ago. So it's almost kind of like a cat and mouse game. You handle for really bad abuse of this kind of genetic engineering on the fly versus the ability to counteract against it because you have better tools to understand what you're capturing and then develop some kind of response to neutralize it. And this is an ongoing cycle of events. It's kind of it's not really published that much. It's not sort of front page news per se,
Yeah.
but believe me, it's a very serious thing that's kind of going on in the background.
Let me just toss this out there.
Sure.
When you said the word pathogen, I thought, all right, artificial intelligence could create a pathogen.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But it seems like by its very nature, unless there's a whole lots of chaos, if chaotic math theory is not theory, but it's actual chaotic math, and it does occur. Yeah. And the chaos itself is predictable, which takes a little bit of the chaos out of it.
Well, it's a range. It's a spectrum.
Okay, perfect.
In other words, you can have like a containment envelope of sorts, where the chaos index peaks at a certain point in the middle and then kind of becomes less so at some known edge factor. But you're never going to have a precise way of knowing what the chaos influences are going to create or not create. You can only have probability indices depending on where you are in the chaos map.
Right, but AI can make all these calculations and predictions and
Oh yeah,
possibilities much faster than a room
yes.
full of really smart people.
That's exactly right, and that's kind of where the quantum computing comes in. That's exactly where it's
So
because
let me ask you
yeah,
this, Charles,
yeah.
can it out, do you envision that it can actually outthink itself? Or to go back to the pathogen example, will it always have an antidote because it designed the pathogen to begin with?
Or a different question would be, would it want to apply the antidote because maybe it decides that the pathogen is the appropriate response because of the human species has become so unruly and overpopulating and destroying the planet, blah, blah, that
That's a
maybe
good one.
maybe we should just let the pathogen do its thing and sort of see what the results are afterwards. That may actually be a reasonable outcome depending upon one's perspective. And in a synthetic sentience-like environment, its rules of what we might call ethical standards may be very different because its priorities may be very different.
I think we'd better all become Zen masters really quickly if this thing is going to be learning from us, because otherwise, I mean, you've seen the Batman series. You remember when Michael Caine said some men just want to watch the world burn?
And there are people like that, and
There are
sadly,
people like
there's
that.
quite a number of them out there. That's true.
There's some of them are just damned mean. They're just sadistic. They really are.
Yeah, no, I
And you
understand.
can say, "Oh, mommy and daddy didn't give them enough attention when they were children." It doesn't matter. This is
Yeah,
what happened, and this is how
yeah,
they.
yeah.
And there will be no shifting them from their position. They
No,
like it.
you're right. No, no, you're 100% right. And in fact, in the world of sort of neurochemistry and behavioral epigenetics and that genre of science, people are trying to understand why is this? Why is there a certain percent of the population that has these incredibly horrific behavioral mechanisms? And you can take two people side by side, and even if they're confronted with a really bad trauma or something really unpleasant, one of the people will try to figure out a better way to deal with it. They'll try to be helpful. They'll try to looks at some sort of positive potential outcome.
Yeah.
The other person will become even more angry and more violent and just go completely off the rails and go crazy. And trying to understand the mechanisms that make that possible. Now, there is actually quite a bit of research looking into the genetic mapping of those kinds of behavioral mechanisms. There's a whole subset of psychodynamics based on genetic content, and this is kind of a tricky and somewhat politically delicate area because people are talking about things like the crime gene and that kind of thing. And
Yeah.
so if we step into the if we step so one possible way of looking at this, and again, this is going to be another one of those scary depictions. Back in the days when the film Gattaca came out, back in the mid '80s, the concept was that people were classified by their genetic content. If
By
you had
what?
by their genetic content.
Right, right.
If your DNA matched the right profile, you were allowed to become whatever the chosen thing was that you're supposed to do, be an astronaut or something else. Okay, fine. So back then that was considered completely theoretical, way off in the future, science fiction-y. Well, not so fast. Actually, today we're very close to being that. In fact, I'm going to show you something. Show and tell is always fun. So
Always.
I couldn't resist bringing a couple of gadgets. So I don't know if you can see this thing. This is an Affymetrix gene chip. This is actually several years old now.
It's what?
It's an Affymetrix gene.
Ah,
You can put your entire genetic code on this little chip. In fact, the new ones are much smaller.
wow.
So in other words, your ID tag of the future, your passport card or your I don't know your state license or driver's license, whatever it's going to be. At some point, it's not going to be a barcode. It's going to be that.
So the cop could look at it and go, "Say, you're a jerk. Get out of the car."
Well, okay, so a lot of people don't like this. By the way, there's a lot of reasons why people are really fearful of their genetic sovereignty turning into something like this. And of course, the motivation from an upside is for the vast number of diseases, ailments, including, by the way, a lot of mental disorders, which can be genetically traced. I mean, this is no longer an if; it's a de facto known science. So, can one say, well, look, if we can map out these different potential problems and counteract for them, this will radically change the cost of healthcare, change the quality of life. We can probably prevent a lot of these rather unfortunate, sort of evil-minded people from doing what they do because maybe we can sort of genetically screen for them and fix this somehow before they start making trouble. But that's the upside. Now, the dark side, of course, one can well imagine, is this becomes a new kind of caste system, and of course, it suggests that there'll be kind of a filtering process. If you don't quite make the genetic grade, well, abort the fetus and done with that. Okay, so what would be the logical sequence of events for this? The one that I think is most likely to become the case, actually, in my opinion, it's always going to be a financial incentive that's going to be the start point for any of these things that are kind of coming down the trail, whether it's telepathic systems, artificial telepathy, like sort of like the ultimate VR, only the telepathic VR, as it were, or it's going to be genetic mapping where your genetic content is willfully submitted to the global database, etc. It'll be an inducement. Consider like this: you're an expecting parent. Um, for a reduced fee for your health insurance, if you agree to sign up and say, okay, you can now sample my yet to be born, baby's genetic content, put into the database, and screen for all these potential, situations that we can counteract for. You'll get a reduction in your healthcare costs. You'll get some kind of tax credit. I can see all kinds of models being wrapped around this. At some point, when enough people begin to sign up for it, which I think they will, it'll become more like a de facto standard, just like the way health insurance is now. Even though I use the word health insurance very loosely, I'm just saying, given the current sort of legal socioeconomic criteria, everybody more or less has to have this so-called health insurance. Okay, fine. So the next thing along those lines will be, well, it's what threshold does submitting your genetic data into the system become a norm, a sort of a standard practice? You can opt out, of course, but for most ordinary people, especially for financial reasons, they'll say, okay, what the hell, sign up and let's do it. So at what point, given a handful of years, 6, 8, 10 years down the trail, where the vast majority of the population base is now permanently woven into this genetic fabric, that's where it'll become the new identification, your access to credit, your access to education, sort of your access to the things of life will start by this determinant factor in your genes. I don't think that's that far at all. In fact, if anywhere is a test of this concept, I think China is going to be the first petri dish to explore how this works. If that's my opinion.
Wow.
And so one of the determining factors was, what's it really cost to extract your genetic code and then implement it as a database? It used to be, many thousands of dollars. Then it got to like $1,000. Then it got down to like $100. In other words, if it gets down to the point where for a couple of dollars I can put your genetic code on this chip and then make that a thing, we're not that far away from that. And this is a function of computing power, of the ways to automate that kind of proteomic decoding. And of course, as one might guess, this is a spectacular example where AI can be applied.
Wow, this is astounding. Now, what about the? I'm thinking CRISPR may be in widespread use in the distant future.
No, it's already. In fact, you can go and to a couple of different sites and buy a CRISPR engine for a few $1,000s, like a desktop printer, basically.
Really?
Yeah, you could have one sitting on your desk now if you wish. I'm not encouraging you to do so per se, but yes. And so the idea of biohacking, which was kind of a loosely used term, more like a cyberpunk kind of like culture norm or something, it's no longer a kind of like a theoretical idea. People are actually doing this.
How much is that device that you have that you can carry your entire genetic code on it? How much is that thing?
Okay, so the actual chip itself, a few dollars. It's the process of putting the code on the chip. That's what costs money. And so that's a function of the actual computing power to decode the actual proteome information, as well as actually being able to extract the proteomics in the first place. But all these processes are being heavily automated. Excuse me. In other words, if you go back to the days of Craig Venter when he first launched his first company, this was a really expensive process, and it would tax the outer frontiers of what was available in supercomputing at the time. This is becoming standard procedure all over the world. It's just a matter of cost.
I've got it too, whatever it is. It's I saw the chemtrails overhead. A lot of people don't believe them.
Yeah.
I do. Because I went out and photographed them one day for about 9 hours till the entire sky was covered with them, and the entire overcast had been put there by aircraft. You could watch them fly over and do it. So,
yeah, as a sort of a sideline, I've had a lot of asthma-like problems in the last couple of years. It's kind of weird. I freely admit I live in a rural area. It's a farming. I'm surrounded on all sides by vineyards and orchards, that kind of thing. So I mean, there's a lot of dust in the air and lots of farm stuff going on. So I don't know, maybe it's but I have noticed it's just gotten a little more difficult to breathe, and I have no idea if that's due to the chemtrails or not. But I just throw it out there saying.
It's due to something, that's for sure.
Yeah,
It's amazing. Well, now where I'm just about vapor locked mentally, but I'm unlocking. I'm
okay.
unlocking. No, you go ahead. But I like where you lead us. I really do.
Well, okay, fair enough. So I mean, it's not all dark at all. All I'm saying, we're kind of at a decision point. It's like a fulcrum, balanced either way. But never before in history that we know of, at least, has the human population on this planet had such a complex, interconnected series of events all sort of happening at the same time. And I would say, well within a decade, a handful of years at most, really, we're going to sort of get a pretty good sense of what direction this might be going towards. We're kind of at a crucial nexus coordinate. That's kind of why I go on the air and have these discussions. So I want to at least get people thinking or looking at the ideas. Now, a lot of people, of course, kind of retract from all this. It's too much, too overwhelming, and I get that. It's completely reasonable. Most folks are just trying to survive. They're trying to put their kids through school. They're paying their mortgage. They have a daily job. It takes a lot of effort, a lot of discipline, really, to digest all these different types of information and sort of come up with a sense of what this might mean. Which, of course, once again, kind of loops back to this outsourced existence thing. In other words, if the average kid in school, let's say within the next handful of years, kind of like the way that calculators were common, but back in an earlier time, it was almost like an intrusion in traditional learning. People were scared that if people started using their calculators all the time, they would kind of forget about basic math skills. And in a certain sense, that's kind of partially true. If you look at social media on the smartphones, just like we were talking about towards the beginning of this program, yes, people are kind of forgetting how to become social. They're submitting themselves to this virtualization of their social presence because of this contraption that they're now glued to all the time. So if we now become ever further connected to a artificial intelligence environment, like an ecosystem of sorts, where we have our local AI engine, but it connects to the sort of cloud resource. And the only way to really succeed or to become better at learning the new skills or becoming more successful in some competitive environment, whatever that is measured by the quality of my AI access, then yes, of course, you're going to see a very specific kind of, almost like an addiction, if you will, to my reliance upon this other version of myself out there in this territory that can process a vastly wider range of information in a much shorter time scale and deliver whatever decision points are required to do my thing, whatever that is. I see that as possibly a good thing, possibly a bad thing, but it certainly is the events that are coming up pretty quickly. And so for a lot of people who don't want to connect to that scale of complexity or that scale of information processing as part of their daily life, they'll be sort of further and further behind, and that gap will become ever larger over time.
You know, inevitably, here, Charles, just for a moment.
Go for it.
Well, let him drink and forget his poverty and remember his trouble no more. To those who are faint at heart, give wine. Blah, blah. So on the human being, this access to AI might be the ultimate drug. Do you remember Torchwood? Remember when those creepy aliens were using the children as a drug? It was just disgusting on a spectacular level.
I don't know the film, but I can appreciate the concept, I guess.
It's a creepy Brit TV series. The guy, okay. Captain Jack somebody,
okay.
he's got a pterodactyl flying around his lab and all this stuff. It's ridiculous.
Okay.
But I was just thinking, will AI be able to achieve some sort of spiritual conceptualization that's real? In other words, it is artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
You are not artificial.
Right. So this is where artificial life comes in. As you're reading in the beginning of my bio stuff, this is why I found such a fascination with artificial life as a concept, because unlike artificial intelligence is kind of a subset of artificial life. And there's many, many different versions of this. Again, going back to sort of the mid 90s onward, there was a process called evolutionary computing, where the idea was to mimic as closely as possible an actual life form as a thing, as a process, to which you could attach AI components because the artificial life would reach out and make use of those AI components in its functionality as a life form. But the idea of creating something that actually really does behave and interact like a biological thing, that's a real known area of research. Now, how far are we from getting to that threshold in the context that you're talking about? Honestly, I don't know. In my opinion, it's more a matter of material science. And you're thinking, what the heck am I talking about? Okay, so right now, most of your computers are based on silicon chips with millions and millions of transistors etched into the surface, and multi layers of this material and multiple repeated etchings. But from the other direction, if you go from a nanotechnology perspective, if you construct from the bottom up molecular assemblies on a vastly smaller scale, now you're approaching a scale of complexity that begins to mimic what an artificial life-like thing might become. So in this context, this is kind of why I remember having this debate many times. I talked with computer science folks, and we were always talking about different architectures and different kinds of software systems and so on. I said, well, that's interesting, but I see more as a material science question. And they would always kind of like, what are you talking about? Well, this is what I'm talking about. So how does synthetic sentience, artificial life, and nanotechnology sort of fit together? This is how it kind of fits together. So the beginning edge of this next paradigm of other computing modalities is becoming sort of more of a thing. And one of the areas that I'm particularly interested in is using light for computing as opposed to pushing electrons around. That is a radically different approach to mimicking what happens in biological systems. As an example, in the human brain or in any brain in an advanced creature, the actual information processing is holographic. In other words, you have trillions of dendrites and synaptic endings communicating with each other. The actual firing rate of those dendrites is slow. It's in the millisecond range. Your typical computer is operating in the gigahertz range. Well, synaptical systems are quite slow, actually, but there's a lot of them, and they're operating in parallel. And you have this distributed information system where, even though there might be certain regions that are localized for specialization, the entire, how can I say, it's information image is distributed throughout this entire network of trillions of synaptic endings communicating with each other. So is there a way to mimic that process using something else other than just a silicon chip? And the answer happens to be with light. So there's a lot of folks who've been working with optical computing with this as their motivation. Can we mimic a lifelike thing using a holographic process engine? And can we use light as the modality for interactive processes and for storage as opposed to electrons? Or can we use a mix and match approach? Can we use a holographic engine as the sort of the core element and then communicate to it externally through more traditional electronic means? These are all on the table as we speak. So the thing you see in the future is not going to be necessarily just a circuit board with some chips and some wires. It'll be sort of a mixture of different component systems.
Somehow I sense D-Wave's fine hand will be in this somewhere.
Oh, absolutely, positively. So it's funny you should mention D-Wave. They were the first ones to go commercial with their quantum computing platform, but they're not the only ones. Google, Intel, IBM, all the major players, they're absolutely chomping at the bit to be the first to the 50 qubit, quantum computing resource, cloud service. That's exactly where things are going. So who's going to get there first? That could be argued. Is there a photonic version of a quantum computer in the works? Yes, there is. That's kind of my favorite version of this, by the way. The current versions are electron spin based. And actually, if you actually see one of these machines, it's kind of surprising. If you walk into a room, you wouldn't see a computer. What you see is a giant canister. Inside that canister, it has to be cooled to 20 millikelvins. 20 millikelvins is just barely above absolute zero.
Wow.
The atoms are like frozen in place. And that's why you can determine what the spin context is, what direction and phase of the spin context of all these different electrons as they're kind of spinning around. And you have to take a snapshot of whatever the number of qubits is you have. That's the number of electron spin vortices you're looking for, and you take a sort of a simultaneous snapshot of the entire matrix of all these different qubits, and you get kind of a collective picture. Here's the quantum state at this particular moment in time. So it's interesting, it's effective, but it's very complicated and very expensive, and sort of it's a first step at this process. Is this really where quantum computing is going to be going in the future? I don't think so. I think this is an important first increment of this process, but I can see much more refined versions of this coming around the corner as the business model to make this resource possible. I can assure you, people are looking for better, easier, less complex ways of getting at this kind of mechanism, of which entangled photons, in my opinion, may be the very next thing that just comes out of this quest.
How do you approach absolute zero, like decompressed liquid oxygen, or what?
Actually, this is kind of interesting. Oddly enough, it's a combination of laser and microwave. I haven't explained this one. It's not traditional cooling as you might think of it.
Yeah.
It's more like you're trying to compact the phase dynamics of atomic motion, and there are ways to do this. If you know what the activities are that are occurring at this particular region of the molecular substrate,
Okay.
and then you can introduce an environment that counteracts that. It sort of forces everything to kind of. So it's not cooling as you would normally think of it, but it's more like motion that you're trying to compress into an ever more steady state.
That is very, very. Who in the world came up with this?
Well, actually, this is classic physics going back many years. Now, one thing I should point out, by the way, one of my favorite things. I mean, if I had lots of money, if I won the lottery tomorrow, I wouldn't be buying a big boat or a plane or something. I'd be filling my house full of all kinds of physics. Here, this is me.
You bet.
Be having all kinds of wild fun. So one of the things I'm particularly bent on or have an interest in is something called squid detectors, or superconducting quantum interference devices. It's kind of a mouthful. What that means is this is a device that can detect extremely minute fluctuations in current, even down to the point of individual atoms kind of moving around, or even electrons spinning around. Depends on how you set up the squid detector. Now, it just so happens that a squid detector is really, really good, by the way, at picking up your neural activity. So if there is a warm temperature superconductive material from which a squid detector could be composed, but by the way, another area of science to sort of know about is superconductivity. This is moving very, very fast. The motivation to open the Pandora's box of so-called warm superconductors is this is $1 trillion world, because once you create warm temperature superconductors that can be applied to all kinds of things, whether it's motors, batteries, solar voltaics, virtually any kind of electrical contraption you can think of, if you can step into the superconductivity world and apply it to those kinds of applications, that's like the holy grail of grails. So there's a lot of reasons why people are pushing at this really hard. But sort of one of the more near-term versions of this, just in a very small way, is to create better versions of squid detectors, which can be used for all kinds of things. But especially in the sort of neural interface stuff, that's one area I see it coming into. But I kind of branched off in this region because I was trying to get across that in the world of quantum devices, superconductivity is kind of a piece of that puzzle. To make it easier to do, less expensive, more applicable to a wider range of. Right now, there's a handful of quantum computers in the world, like a few dozen, that sort of thing, and they're big and they're complicated and they're expensive. And you're not going to see one in your house anytime soon. In fact, the near-term business is going to be major providers like IBM and Google and so on, who will have these things in a site somewhere, and you get access to the computing power through a cloud service. That's the near term. In the next increment, they'll be smaller, easier. Local businesses will have them sort of parked in their office building somewhere. There'll be a progression of events, just like in the computing age, only this is the quantum age, as it were.
Now here comes another one out of left field. Is there anything to suggest that humankind ever approached this level of scientific study and accomplishment ever before?
And that's a question I've asked myself many times. There's a lot of debate about this. Now, I personally offer the idea that this is unprecedented territory, that we're stepping into an evolutionary threshold that really has not been experienced in a history that we know of, but it might underlie in the history that we know of. Now, I would offer the idea that if we had been at this level in a past time, there'd still be, I don't care how badly we screwed the planet up, how horrible of a nuclear war there might have been, whatever, there'd still be bits and pieces left over from that earlier time. There'd be enough residue of a previous civilization to get spectrographical information, if nothing else. And I just don't see that. I think that there were localized examples of really interesting exotic technology. I look at some of the ancient sites that have been constructed where you see the obvious quality of stonework, you see the incredible commitment to resource to create these fantastic monuments that were not only precisely constructed, but mapped to stellar coordinates and this kind of thing. You have to ask yourself, why and who would do this and how did they actually get this done? So could this been the artifact of some kind of ET presence at the time? Maybe. I mean, I'm willing to walk that path, but I'm not quite ready to walk the path that says that our planetary civilization was at the same scale of technical development that we are now. That might be too much of a stretch, at least for me. That's just my opinion.
What do you, Charles? What do you make of this outfit at CERN? I've said this many times. The Caravanners have heard this many times, but a young scientist, young woman, was there talking about. She talked and talked and talked and talked, and then said something about opening a portal. And then, just a few months ago, Chinese were reportedly building a laser that was so powerful it could actually rip a hole in space. Are you into any of those sorts of things?
Well, okay, so the argument suggests that are we beginning to probe the edge of being able to manipulate space-time as a thing to do?
Yeah.
And I would say there's a lot of motivation for this, by the way. As an example, if we are to leave this planet and start migrating elsewhere, now let me back up just a second. As a philosophical idea, I think it's appropriate that we go through a series of evolutionary tests, trauma cycles, if you will, because we have to, in my opinion, we have to kind of show our worth. We have to show that we're credible enough to be allowed to sort of start spreading our population elsewhere. I think that we're still kind of primitive. We have some positive attributes, but a lot of, unfortunately, immature negative attributes as well. Kind of like a toddler with a loaded gun in its hand. We have all these fantastically interesting technical tools we're inventing, but I'm not sure we have the maturity to really understand how to use them in a more harmonious kind of way. It's just sort of how I see it. And yet, we're kind of on the beginning edge of beginning to unravel the mysteries of time-space manipulation. Can we create gravity wells in demand? Can we tear the fabric of time-space as a thing to do? Can we deliver the energy density required to actually warp time-space? Can we create a gravity well so we can sort of use that as a way to get off this planet and start to travel around to other stars? To me, that's what this signifies. The physics experiments are fascinating, but a kind of an artifact of this kind of research is that ability to create essentially what we might call warp drive, for a better choice of words. And I think there's a lot of mathematical constructs that show the theoretical aspects of how this might actually be workable. But the energy requirements to make that workable, at least in the physics that we currently are aware of, is still a pretty big pill to swallow. However, these kinds of CERN experiments, as an example, are kind of like beginning edge. It's kind of like it's like when you drive to Las Vegas and you're not there yet, but you can kind of see the glow in the horizon, but you can't really see the city or the lights. But you can see this glow. That's kind of how I see this. We're just beginning to get at the hint of this concept of how we can begin to manipulate space-time and hopefully apply it in some useful way. But in my opinion, that's what a potential outcome would be. It would be a pathway to understanding how to get this process the deliverable. Now, there's other ways, by the way, to get at time-space manipulation, and I think that that's another one of these lurking kind of in the background, sort of more like in the dark projects universe. How far have we actually gotten to showing examples of this? That could be argued. But in a way, going back to CERN, they're doing experimental physics, which kinds of, in a way, verifies these ideas.
I'm sensing that there is certainly I'm not trying to pull you into anything here, but seriously, I'm sensing that there is a component of spiritual accountability with you, because you've said going through trauma cycles,
Yeah.
showing ourselves to be worthy to take another step.
Right.
Maybe we need help. Maybe we need these machines. Maybe we're not necessarily enough. And then on the other hand, maybe we are. Maybe these machines that are being built will reveal what we're really capable of as human beings, and we're just not aware of it. We can't. I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it. Maybe and then the other part is that if I hadn't have believed it, I wouldn't have seen it. Maybe that's what these super duper spectacular computer mechanisms will do for us, is make us believe it so we can see it.
Well, or maybe change our perception of consciousness as a thing that we currently recognize.
Yeah.
The sort of it's like a target where like a series of concentric circles and there are targets in the middle. Our perception of what consciousness is at the moment may be in a state of change, and we may not know what that state is going to become. But I might offer the following idea.
Yeah.
Going back to the world of CRISPR and genetic engineering, that sort of thing. Let's say just for a moment that we begin to step into the territory of GMO humanoids. I just throw it out there. As a matter of fact, if I could be completely off the rails here for a moment,
please.
I tend to believe, speaking of ET and previous civilizations and technology and so on, I tend to hold the belief that we actually are humanoid GMOs. I think if you're going to make any kind of an argument for technology from a previous era or civilizations from an earlier time having things that we don't have now, or something along those lines, I would submit to you that I follow the history of the Anunnaki, and I'm very respectful of the records that have been dug up and processed, and people have tried to categorize these kinds of historical references very carefully. And I think there's enough evidence to suggest it's plausible that we probably were visited at a certain point in time, a number of millennia ago, and that the visiting entity in question found the local hominids sort of useful, but figured we got to tune them up a little bit so they can mine gold for us or do other things that are relevant for our localized interest. And so they tweaked us a little bit. And in fact, if anything, they not only tweaked us to become more like what we are now, so we could be just barely smart enough to do manual labor, etc., but they also, and this is the part you might find kind of fascinating, maybe, they tweaked some of our behavioral genetics so we'd have a excessive proclivity for worship, for religious orientation, so that we would see them as the God people or the God entities and be devoted to their cause, whatever it was, and have unquestioning submission to their instruction or their will. And if you look at all these different major of the world, their stories are remarkably similar. The gods from the stars, the star gods, the sky people, however you want to call it. Yeah. They came to us. We were created in their image. That whole thing. I mean, you can go on and on. But what I'm getting at is it is a surprisingly consistent historical story that replicates throughout the world. Is it reasonable that a visiting ET would have chosen the local available life form and modified to suit their interests? Yes, I think it's extremely reasonable. Would it be further reasonable that if they have that kind of genetic modification capacity, which I'm sure they would they want to make sure that we'd be malleable and sort of submitting to their interests? Yes, of course. And in fact, to verify this idea, speaking of fMRI analysis of brain activity, it's well known, of course, that quite a lot of behavioral attributes can now be categorized and mapped, and it's very well exposed. So one of the interesting things about a lot of this fMRI research is that about 30% of the population does have a particular response to religious influence. And it's kind of amazing. In fact, in the amygdala, it lights up. When you scan the brain for certain kinds of activities and you offer different kinds of stimuli, different regions light up rather prolifically. And
yeah, I've seen that.
And categories of various populations, it's very prolific. It's like it's either yes or no. And so why would that be there? And in other words, what would be the natural evolutionary drivers that would kind of force this rather extreme magnified version for religious orientation, for blind belief in whatever the thing is going to be? Was it there because we were supposed to be part of the God entity, or was it there because it was a programming feature that was designed to make us more suitable to the local GMO interests at the time? I'm kind of a pragmatic guy. I kind of lean for that second one myself. Now,
well, it's okay, except for one thing, and that is who programmed the Anunnaki to program us?
Well, no, don't want, and I understand completely that there's a larger question there. I'm not trying to imply.
No, no, I get you. I mean, I'm not pulling out I'm not
Yeah,
swashbuckling.
yeah. I mean, I tend to be rather spiritual. I mean, I'm not necessarily believing in God per se, but I think there's something much larger than us. I think we belong to some larger sort of cosmic ecosystem, and to call it a spiritual interpretation, if you like. I mean, I'm certainly open to those kinds of ideas. I was just trying to be more localized, since you brought up the question of whether were we at a point where we had technological development, kind of what we have now, et cetera, et cetera. And I was kind of relating to my version of, and answering that question is, I think there were examples of exposure to technology of a moment. And this was probably due to ET intervention or visitation at certain points in time, an artifact of which was to create the humanoid GMOs that we've now become. And unfortunately, because of that proclivity for irrational belief systems, and I'm not trying to intrude on anybody's religion, I'm not throwing stones at a glass house. I very much respect people's faith, and I'm not in any way trying to attack that. I'm just saying, as a practical matter, because of the extreme nature of some levels of irrational belief systems being what they are, a lot of the world's problems that we see today, and certainly many of the wars and sort of horrible things that people have done to each other for many centuries going into the past, were based almost exclusively on these sort of extremist versions of different religious paradigms being applied to manipulate people to do whatever the thing was at the moment. So why would that be there? What would be the genetic purpose for embedding that particular kind of response pattern, that particular kind of neurochemistry mechanism to make such an extreme outcome? In my mind, in my opinion, it was because it was programmed there to begin with. And
Yeah.
if there was ever a reason for ET to visit us now, which I think they are, I think that's reasonable. The reason they'd be here now is because they're going, hey, look, we know about what happened before. We know about this planet Earth and these humanoids, and yeah, they're kind of messed up in a way. They were, taken advantage of, and they're like the GMO leftovers of this earlier interaction with these other ETs. And now they've kind of crossed the line. They've shown a proclivity for global scale war. They've shown a proclivity for nuclear weapons in war. But now they're getting dangerous because they're using nanotechnology. They're using genetic engineering. They're well into the world of artificial intelligence and artificial life and all the other sort of milestones, these evolutionary mechanisms coming one after the other. And they're just, speaking of CERN, they're just beginning to sort of break open the Pandora's box of time-space manipulation and creating wormholes, perhaps, and things like this. Clearly, if we let this kind of go on, they are going to start wandering to our neighborhood. We better get in there and have a closer, third, fourth look at this and kind of see what's going on. So, I mean, if there was ever a reason for them, it was because of these unfortunate attributes of our earlier GMO processing that created some of the rather negative behaviors we're demonstrating now.
I think that's an interesting theory. I think the answer that you're looking for, though, is that no. Let me rephrase that. That has the potential to be insulting, and I do not mean that in any way.
Fire it up. I mean, nothing. It's okay. It's fine.
Well, I don't want to be insensitive because you're not exactly an unintelligent person. Okay, you're a brilliant person, but here's the thing: what if there were no program? What if the program was that there be no program? Hence the two words: free will. Free will. Make it as you will.
Yeah.
Pass or fail, sink or swim, pervert it or don't pervert it, do or do not. What if there is no program?
No, I agree with you that free will versus determinism are like two ends of a spectrum. And so determining kind of where we are between those 2 points is kind of an open debate, and I don't claim to have any specific
And
answer.
what if it's a combination?
Yeah, but as I see it, my opinion is it's a ratio of one versus the other. We have a certain range of free will potential, and I think this varies a lot between different individuals. It varies a lot within certain cultural memes, as it were, but are much less inclined to exercise a free will in a functional way. Others are almost at the extreme frontier of there's no structure at all. It's just complete free will and nothing else. I think it varies quite a bit. And that may be part of this evolutionary threshold, is to sort of narrow that down a little bit. I'm just guessing, but that's kind of how I see it as a possible outcome.
Well, it's all a guess, when you come right down to it. And a lot of, if you're right enough times, then it's like they give you awards for things. But, I kind of roll with what Tom Waits wrote into a song. It's a goofy little song, but it rang a couple of bells. And the lyric is, everything you can think of is true.
Okay, I'll go with that.
On some level, that's
Determining, but given your sphere of existence, truth is a relative concept. If all I want to process is the stuff that's in my immediate sphere of consciousness, yes, of course, it's a truth as I determined to be. But if you extend beyond that point, that becomes a little more iffy, because truth has to connect to the outside world in some context.
Yeah. Or you wind up living in your own little world. How many people have been accused of that?
Well, so one of the things that I kind of see as a potential outcome of this, as I was saying some time ago in this conversation, if we are stepping into this territory of outsourcing existence, and people become ever more enamored of the idea as an option to say, I'm going to have my existence externalized to these other AI entities that represent me and are part of my consciousness, et cetera, et cetera. It's a symbiotic coevolution that I accept as a new norm. It's the thing to do, versus a bunch of other people that will probably never go there and in fact retreat even further away from it. So the range of reality, the truth index, if you will, of what can be cognized or what can be observed is going to be very much dictated by that caliber of access.
Yeah, I like it. I do. I have to ask you one more thing. You've been very gracious with your time. I thank you for that very much.
It's all good.
What's all this about a flying fusion reactor that Lockheed Martin?
Oh, yes. This is quite fun. So I go back to the days of the early tokamak research. This goes again back to the sort of late 70s, early 80s, etc. Now, to me, fusion is a beautiful thing. If we can actually do this, it really is a spectacular change of the world's energy profile. There's an enormous economic incentive. I mean, I'm very proactively trying to support positive technology development. Even though I kind of go off these sort of darkish ruminations about how things might go positive or negative, there's some real positive stuff to look at. This is one of them. Okay, so the other fusion reactor types, and there's several different flavors of this concept, but the basic idea is you want to create a star in a containment vessel of sorts. That is, you want to have fusion where atoms are being sort of smashed together to become larger atoms. And the whole idea is when that occurs, you get a fantastic amount of energy. But you're not dealing with fissile material. You're not taking heavy isotopes and breaking them apart to create heat so you can drive some kind of an engine. It's the exact opposite. You're actually creating new elements by combining them. And in the process, you give off an astonishing amount of energy. So can one control this fusion in some kind of a sustainable fashion? So in the earlier days, you had giant lasers used to hit deuterium targets. In fact, I worked on one of those systems at one point. And you have magnetic confinement where you sort of create a temporary moment of fusion, like for a couple of femtoseconds, and then it dies, of course. But the whole idea is, can you create a sustainable version of this? And if so, how big and how complex of a thing can you, what size and how complicated is it to make one of these things? So there's several different projects going on around the world. The one I'm kind of particularly interesting is something called the Stellinator. It's a German project. It's a beautiful system. It's a large toroidal plasma field with a spiraling toroid. It's probably about the most complex feat of engineering that's ever been attempted by anyone in all of known history. It's a fantastic thing to look at.
Oh, is that all?
But right, and so my question is, will it ever produce something useful? And hopefully it does. Meanwhile, Lockheed's been very quiet about this until recently. They have a somewhat different, and so they have now their patents have been issued. Now, I went to Lockheed myself actually in 2006 to give a talk at the Biological Metaphors in Computing. There was an event there, a 3-day-long event, one day of which was devoted to this idea of artificial life and artificial intelligence applied to self-evolving networks, that kind of thing. And as you read in my bio, I was once on the board of a company called Evolutionary Networks, and this is what we do. We actually created this sort of thing. So Lockheed invited me to come out there and talk to them. So when I was there, I got to meet a bunch of their other engineering groups and just sort of hang out for a while. This was in Florida. And I actually met a group of people who were, as it turns out, kind of involved in element transmutation, which is another subcategory I could wander into. But what I'm getting at was, it seemed to me that if they were spending a lot of effort and interest in element transmutation, then it seemed like they would probably be doing something in the world of fusion as well. It's a level of science that would promote this idea. So going back a few years, an article came out very briefly, just a couple of paragraphs with a very small little tiny photograph saying, oh, and here's their pickup truck size fusion reactor prototype, da da da. And it was actually a trade journal. It's not for public dissemination. It was more like an internal trade journal. I said, that's interesting. All right, let's see how far they go with this. So then a couple of years later, a couple of, again, brief articles popped up, more like science journal kind of things. Then all of a sudden, patent issued. Lockheed's patent. So they claim they actually have a semi-working prototype about the size of a SUV, more or less. Now, nobody's really claimed to have seen this working that they're talking about, and I can assure you that this is absolutely 100%, military interest is where this is going initially. Because after all, if you can get a flyable, if you will, or a transportable fusion engine into space, that's the holy grail of grails. As far as if you want to have space travel, space defense, being able to go to the moon back and forth, go to Mars, all that kind of stuff, and you have a fusion engine to drive your system,
Yeah.
you own the world at this point. In my humble opinion, I think that space really is the next big ticket item that everyone. I mean, China's very aggressive in this area. Of course, we are too. People begin to recognize that we probably are going to end up going to the asteroids to mine for minerals, and there's all kinds of reasons to populate space for all sorts of practical reasons. And whoever can get a fusion reactor into space, they will own that territory. They will own the world's economy from that point onward, at least from that perspective.
And Lockheed Martin is right in the middle of it.
Apparently so. Now, like I said, nobody's claimed to have seen it do its thing yet. But the fact that they were issued patents on this, and like I said, I've had bits and pieces of information dribbling in my direction and a little bit of hearsay back and forth. Let's just say they've certainly gone pretty far down the trail of getting, at least aiming at this direction.
Wow. That thing about quantum entangled networks, it's so one thing. Go ahead.
No, that's all right. So maybe I should explain what this means, because it's kind of a tricky topic to
no speed of light limitations.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly. So imagine now, if you will, a pair of photons, or even a single photon you cut in half, and there's ways to do this. And these photons are linked together. They're then separated by hundreds of miles. You rotate one of the photons on its axis, the other photon responds instantaneously.
Wow.
At the exact same time. Now that is what Einstein called spooky physics.
Calls what?
That's what Einstein called spooky physics.
Spooky physics. I like it.
That's the actual Einsteinian term for it. So going back to CERN one more time, by the way, since, people are wondering, well, what's all this mean? Why would this be relevant? Okay, a couple of things. So in the world of cosmology, there's been a big debate going on. How many dimensions really are there? It's not just four. Our brain's designed to cognize 3 spatial and 1 temporal dimension set, but clearly there's a lot more than that going on. So to mathematically work out the detailed minutia of things like dark matter and dark energy and sort of the behavior of these really large-scale sort of cosmological events that we can now measure spectrographically, if we try to calculate what's really going on from that perspective, you have to have more dimensions. It just mathematically, to make the model work, it's what needs to be done.
Makes sense.
But as a sort of an artifact of that, when you try to explain how does quantum entanglement work, it can't possibly work in 4 dimensions, but it works really great if you just add a couple more dimensions. In other words, if you're willing to step outside the box of your typical X, Y, Z, and that's the only limitation you have to work with, and there's only one linear monodirectional time dimension. No, if you add more dimensions, then all of a sudden these seemingly impossible quantum entanglement things become very possible. In fact, it's sort of mundane. So it turns out that there's been a big question: can we show quantum entanglement in biological systems? The answer is yes. It's been shown in photosynthesis. It's been shown in the migratory system of birds. It's been shown in all sorts of really complex proteomic systems where when you have, say, protons going across a membrane or electrons going down a thylakoid, that's photosynthesis, and the interactivity between photons stimulating electron movement and the electrons migrating through the thylakoid system, as an example, it turns out that, yes, this quantum entanglement occurs in all sorts of natural systems. So could quantum entanglement happen in us? Could quantum entanglement begin to explain things like telepathy, as an example?
Sure, why not?
Could explain things like precognition, as an example. And that's why I kept going on and on about this artificial telepathy stuff, even though for the moment it's all about headsets and special sensors and all this kind of stuff. To me, that's kind of Rube Goldbergish. I think where it's going eventually is stepping directly into this quantum entanglement mechanism as it applies to our consciousness.
Well, that's not too much of a stretch to me, Charles, because, I mean, this is a really rudimentary example.
No, it's fine.
But in the same way that a joke or a catchphrase or something like that, just suddenly everyone seems to know about it. And,
yeah.
it's almost
Exactly.
we all think they thought of it at the same time, and they did.
Okay.
Because there was enough mental action going out there to cause that to happen.
So there's something called the GCP, Global Consciousness Project, and anybody can go there and log in and see what they're doing. But so for the past, this is Princeton University, by the way. So for the past almost 2 decades now, one of the things about entanglement, randomness is a really hard thing to do mathematically. A lot of effort spent to make ever more perfect randomization systems for crypto keys and for all kinds of purposes where randomness is a mathematical requirement. So a RNG, or random number generator, which uses a variety of different techniques depending on what kind of an RNG it is, to spit out a perpetual stream of random numbers, that's actually a kind of a fragile thing, really. So if quantum entanglement occurs as an artifact of collective mass consciousness, in other words, just like you're saying, a certain size of a group of people, 1,000 people, 10,000 people, whatever it is, are all affected by some event, or they purposefully try to affect an event, a mass prayer event, or a collective thought exercise of some kind, whatever it might happen to be, a response to a tragedy like 9/11 or the 2005 tsunami in Thailand, whatever it might happen to be, pick a major event where many, many people are affected. Can that collective conscious event be shown to affect a physical system? And what would be the best sort of easy, low-hanging fruit way to measure this? Well, one would be the change of randomness in an RNG system, which would be subject to the influences of quantum entanglement, affecting its otherwise more perfect randomness. It so happens that a bunch of these RNGs are sprinkled around the world. There's ever more. There's about 200 of them now. They go to a central supercomputer processing facility at Princeton. They take in this vast amount of randomized number generated data, correlate that to mass constant events, and sure enough, about 70% of the time, there's a noticeable change in randomness in these RNGs. It's very consistent, actually.
Wow.
And that's today. Amazing. And this is published. Anybody can go there. It's a peer-reviewed documentation. So there's a number of institutes. There's one near here actually called the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and Dean Radin, who's a very well-known physicist, has been working on this exact kind of science for a long time. There's other physicists who are working on this as well, some of which are public, some of which are not. But as you might imagine, if we can now show rather empirically that at some threshold enough people focusing their mental attention in some given direction can affect a system, there's a lot of folks who take interest in this kind of thing. Not the least of which would be people involved in marketing, politics, socioeconomic trend analysis. I mean, all kinds of, as well as other maybe darker, things that one comes to mind. But we're sort of nibbling at the beginning edge, and that's why I was kind of going on about the squid detectors earlier, because if there was ever a way to possibly look at the correlates between quantum entanglement and consciousness and focused intent, as it were, would a squid detector system be a possible physical instrument that could look at this in a more precise kind of way? Possibly. It's just one of several to choose from, but it's the one that I sort of look at as being my sort of preferred favorite for the moment. But in other words, we're sort of stepping into the territory. Once again, we're not quite there yet, but the pieces of the puzzle are certainly sort of coming into view. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. We have lots of pieces and they're all sprinkled around, but we're starting to see clumps of pieces sort of come together, so a partial picture is becoming more evident. But the fact that we can prove that quantum entanglement does work, that now we actually have, believe it or not, a quantum internet experiment being set up, and then within a year you're going to see this, where you can have entangled photons over great distances between nodes sprinkled around the planet in different areas, and everything happens at the exact same time. And more interestingly, if you begin to observe, if you interact with the photons in any way, the quantum coherency collapses instantly. So not only is a zero time of flight communication mechanism, it's also the perfect crypto system. And for a lot of military interests, I'm sure you can imagine why this is a kind of a big deal.
Oh, yeah.
So there's been a kind of a quantum arms race, sort of, between China, demonstrating their version of this, and us demonstrating our version of this.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm going to just speculate. I'm just speculating now. When the X-37, the sort of autonomous, sort of like the miniaturized version of a special, but it was flying around for a couple of years autonomously, people say, "Well, what's going on? Why is this thing up there? What's going? And what are the? There's other things like it, by the way, also being put into orbital and suborbital patterns. Why would these craft be doing their thing? Well, surveillance, obviously, but there's other things going on. I'm going to guess that making our version of our space quantum entanglement network system more robust than the Chinese. Now, the Chinese have been surprisingly open about this because I think they're trying to show off the world, hey, we can do this. Okay, fine. So on several occasions now, they've had satellites in orbit doing quantum entanglement network communication with multiple nodes on the ground. I mean, this has been done many times over with, aircraft in flight, sites on the ground communicating to aircraft communicating to satellites, back and forth. So, I mean, this is becoming a done deal. The scale of which this can be done and the distances involved, because over distance, even though the entanglement is maintained, there's other factors that begin to interfere with the mechanism. So now there's been a big push to have quantum repeaters, if you will. So, I'm serious. So in other words,
no, I know you are. I know you are.
Yeah. So are into a so think about this just for a moment. One sort of mundane but very practical way of looking at this as an example. If you look at the world's trading systems, if you go to the stock exchange, that kind of thing, as you probably well know, like in Wall Street, that area, people pay enormous amounts of money to buy a better position on the backbone. In other words, where you are in the fiber optic network, that is the main sort of pipe, if you will, that all these different trading systems communicate with each other. If I can be a few miles closer to where the server farm is versus the other guys further away, I've bought in a handful of microseconds or maybe a few milliseconds of extra time between my trading moments. This is how the stock market works right now. The humans aren't even part of this. I mean, the idea of a bunch of guys in a room, trying to negotiate which stock they should buy, that's completely ridiculous. It's all computerized. No, I'm serious. In fact, this is, if it wanted to pick an area where AI really is being put to the test in an extreme way, that's exactly where it is. So aside from different kinds of trading algorithms and being able to do adaptive analysis to determine where the trend might be in the next handful of milliseconds, that kind of thing, where you are physically on the backbone, where your physical location is, where your server farm or where your computers are compared to where somebody else's is, if that buys you a few milliseconds of time, you're going to have a much more successful trading experience, as it were. So people spend fantastic sums of money to be positioned wherever they happen to be on the backbone. Now, if all this disappears because of this real-time, absolute crypto protected, no delay whatsoever, sort of quantum internet replacing that mechanism, imagine that affecting the trading modalities that we see now versus what the trading modalities might be in the future. That's like one example.
Wow. Mind blowing. Really good. I mean, well, look, leave everybody with one inspirational, mind-blowing kiss off. You know what I mean?
I would say this, that it's an interesting time to be alive. You asked me at the very beginning of all this, gee, Charles, how did you start out? And I said, I have tremendous ADHD problems. I'm interested in everything, and I have undying curiosity. So for me, I'm just fascinated by being able to witness this. In fact, if anything, I'm kind of getting on in years, and I don't know if I'll be alive long to sort of see the ultimate outcome. I'm just curious to see how this turns out, because I feel very strongly we're really on a threshold with some major evolutionary change on a planetary scale, and say 20 years from now, I'd be fascinated to see how this all turns out. Whether or not I'm actually here, that could be an argument, but so I mean, I was bored a tad too soon. On a more sort of generalized view, a lot of people are going to be facing really interesting, not even challenges, just changes. Maybe that's a better way to put this. The rate of change is going to be really prolific. For younger people, it's an interesting time because maybe they'll have a good chance at connecting into these adaptive as they occur and hopefully proliferating and doing well by them. For a lot of the older folks that may or may not connect that well with all this, it may be a test. I mean, it's going to be positive for some and perhaps not so positive for others. That's my honest way of looking at it.
Well, that's pretty darn good.
Well, I would say this much, though. if the tools that can be harvested from this sort of collection of different technologies can do things like provide a healthier life, improve one's cognition and mental capacities, that sort of thing, that's a really positive. Just that alone, I think, is enough to be encouraging for the general sort of sense of how this is going.
Well, yeah, we don't want the human being to be left behind. Where's the fun there?
Well, so the thought I would offer is, if we're stepping into the territory of a Gattaca-like realm, where genetic selection may become part of the norm of a not too distant future, where
Yeah.
where we can modify who we may be the last of our kind. This may be a different way of looking at it. We're kind of these rudimentary biological contraptions, pieces of machinery, as it were. And right now we're in the very verge of, a lot of people get modifications done to them already, maybe for cosmetic reasons, but also for a lot of serious medical situations where they need to have transplants and different kinds of organs moved around and modified and prosthetics and that kind of thing. So can we get beyond that point and just go directly to sort of genetic modifications to suit various potential outcomes? A lot of people would be horrified at this, I'm sure. But the idea is that, once again, it's a tool set. And it's the natural evolution of a development of a species type. If you go backwards in time to your earliest cave dwellers, whatever, they began to use bones, as a weapon. They began to make flint arrowheads. They began to figure out how to make fire. Okay, fine. So you progress to our current moment in time. We have a vastly better set of tools. And the tools will actually modify who we are. Is that a violation of nature, or is that actually part of nature? I tend to lean towards it's a part of nature. It's what's actually happening.
I would tell you, I really would. Yeah, something like that came up just recently, and it was like, we're not observers. We're integral components of it. So let's not forget that,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the potential sort of inspirational moment is, if this turns out okay, or if the evolutionary threshold we're crossing evolves to a better form, yes, we'll be different than what we are now, but we'll probably be an improvement, perhaps, over what we currently are. The limitations that we're often challenged by, the process of aging, as an example, the process of losing our mental capacity over time, those sorts of things, that may change radically, and maybe in a much better way. I honestly don't know. It's possible, at least.
We could use a little improvement, I'm thinking.
I think we could use a lot of improvement, actually.
Generally speaking.
I would certainly agree with that.
You know what? You're a planetary treasure. You really are.
Oh my God.
What a pleasure talking to you. I can't believe it's been over 4 years since we've spoken, and that will not happen again. Okay.
No, I'm always happy to engage in these sorts of things. It's good. I like it.
Just a total blast. Well, do me a favor and hold on for just a second before you ring off, would you?
Sure.
And thank you very much for spending so much time with us.
No, and thank you for having me. It's always good.
All right. Well, that's the man. He's a legend, but he's certainly no myth. He's absolutely real. And wow, was that a little mind twister or what? Anyway, let's keep in mind that discovery is fun. It really is. You need to be a little bit careful. When you discover something really significant, be especially careful in the application. Yeah? All right. Exercise caution in your daily affairs. Keep those eyes up always. Sharpen those critical skills. There's a lot to think about. And Charles Ostman is entirely correct. This is an exciting time to be alive. So let it invigorate you. Don't let it worry you. To heck with all that nonsense. We're all going to check out of here one day anyway. So what exactly are we afraid of? All right. God bless. Be seeing you.